Congressman Baird, thank you so much for joining me.
Really a pleasure, Matt. Thank you for having me. Thanks for your work.
Why don't we start off with your background? You can, give us an intro to where you started, sort of the arc of your career so far, and where you are now.
Well, it's one of the interesting things about Congress is people get there in lots of different ways. And, I grew up in a little tiny town in Western Colorado, ended up going to University of Utah, majored in powder skiing, and somehow managed a degree in psychology. And then I became really fascinated with neuropsychology and clinical psychology, and ended up earning a doctorate in psychology, moved out to Washington State to work at a VA hospital initially, and spent more than 20 years doing clinical work and also academic work. I was chair of a department of psychology for a time. And then, as I say, I went off my medication and ran for Congress. And against great odds, people thought there was no way I could win. And people called me Don Quixote, et cetera, and surprised people. And though I didn't succeed my first run, it was a whisker close race. And then I ran again for what ended up being an open seat. Served 12 years in the House representing Southwest Washington, a rural swing district, classic swing district. In fact, it was Republican before I held it, and it became Republican again after I left. I retired in 2010. Have two kids. We started our family late in life, and I retired because I realized I wasn't going to see them grow up if I didn't. And so have since been doing a number of things. I was president of a university for a time, did some consulting, and did some stay-at-home dad work, which is maybe the most important job of all, and wrote a couple books, and now leading a really exciting effort, which we can talk about, to create a national museum and center for service. So a really diverse and interesting background. I feel very fortunate, actually, in many, many ways.
Well, before we move on to the Congress stuff, maybe we talk about the service element first. Can you talk to, what is it that you're trying to do with the museum, and, give us a little bit of background on that and why it's important?
Well, thanks for asking, Matt. If you think about it, service is absolutely fundamental to a democratic republic. We talk a lot about exporting democracy, and people always say, oh, well, they had free and fair elections, they have the rule of law, they've got a constitution, all of which is great. But if you don't have a fundamental ethic of service to the greater good in the people who run for office and the people who vote, then the democracy is going to fail. Because what happens, and we've seen it time and time again, is people use the democratic process to gain power with a veneer of legitimacy, and then they abuse that power once they get it. They focus on how they expand their personal wealth, their personal power, how they help their cronies, how they entrench their party, instead of saying, what is the interest of the greater good? So one reason for doing this is because the sense of service to the greater good is the essential ingredient to our democratic republic. The second reason is the stories are beautiful and uplifting. We have many monuments and memorials, as we should, to military service. But if you think about it, there's no monument or memorial or museum in the nation, really, that honors all form of service, that tells the stories of the doctors and nurses, the people who volunteer in disaster areas, the organizations that help refugees overseas, the folks who are there when crises hit. Hundreds of millions of Americans, from government organizations, non-government organizations, faith-based secular groups, dedicate themselves to service. It's fundamental to our nation, and we have no place in the nation to tell the story. So I'm trying to establish a national museum and center for service, to have a prominent place near the National Mall, but also to infuse the service ethos throughout our country. And I think it's fundamental to our democracy.
Well, it's interesting, the concept of service, in my view, is also a way to reduce the cost of government, right? Because if you took all the congressmen, the senators, the president, and the cabinet, et cetera, and you put a market rate on their compensation, I'm sure that we'd be paying a lot more for their service than we do, right? I mean, how many millions would the president have to make, right? And how many millions would a senator have to make, or a congressman, and to attract the kind of person that you want into that role, right? And so without a underlying service value in the community, I think the cost of government would be enormous compared to what it is.
Well, and not only that, it's an excellent point, Matt, but especially for staff. Our staff are so underpaid, congressional staff, and in many government levels, the staff they're wonderful people working incredible hours, difficult jobs, requires lots of skill, and we don't pay them well. But on top of that, think of the value, and it's been estimated at many, many hundreds of billions of dollars that service gives back to our community. All the volunteer hours and sadly, many service workers are underpaid, whether it's teachers, nurses, et cetera. That helps keep the economy going, helps keep our nation strong. But we need to inspire it. We need to honor it and recognize it. And we need, frankly, Matt, something that unites us, because we divide over everything in this country, almost everything. But when there's a crisis and people come together for service, it's a beautiful thing, because they set aside their political differences, they set aside religious differences, and they just say, how can I help? And we need more of that.
Excellent. Well, let's move on to your career, and why don't we start with your time in Congress and your district in particular. You mentioned it earlier in Washington. I like to typically start off with congressman interviewees talking about the district. And so, what is unique about that district, and how did it change over time while you served it?
Well, I was so privileged to represent the 3rd district. It's the 3rd congressional district. It's basically all of Southwest Washington. And if people know sort of the more or less the Northwest geography, the Columbia River formed the southern border. So we were right across the river from the state of Oregon, very near Portland. The main population center was Vancouver, Washington, which we like to say Vancouver, not BC, Washington, not DC. And Vancouver is a somewhat of a suburb community, but it's also got a lot of great features itself. And the Columbia River, of course, comes and then curves up north and then swings back west again. My district went up the Columbia River Gorge to about where the Cascade Mountains come down south, then everything to the coast and as far north as Olympia. So big geographic district, would take you about 5.5 hours to drive from the southeast corner to the northwest corner. A lot of timber, a lot of extractive resources, some ports, a swing district classically, in the sense, as I mentioned earlier, Republican before I took it. I held it 12 years and then retired. It became immediately Republican again, went for Trump this last year. And so it's changed a lot. Rural, hardworking, salt to the earth folks, and then some high-tech industry as well. In some ways a bellwether for some of the changes that have been going on in our country, especially vis-a-vis party identification, et cetera.
Got it. And did it change while you were there in terms of its makeup and economy, et cetera?
It did in several ways. We redistricted it at one point, so the borders shifted a little bit. It wasn't a profound change. It changed more after I left, the redistricting, just because of the nature of the population demands. We have an independent commission in Washington state, so there's not a lot of profound gerrymandering that happens. But what happened, one of the things that happened was the blue collar jobs began to decline. The timber mills either closed down or many of them closed down. This pulp and paper mills did. So too the aluminum smelters. So a lot of the blue collar union jobs shifted away. And high tech moved in, which brought different kinds of jobs. But we often saw this tension of the folks who'd made their living off the land, the loggers, the fishermen, the folks who worked in steel mills, et cetera. They were losing that blue collar middle class income, and that population struggled quite a bit. So there was that. The area grew a lot, as much of the Northwest has, particularly the Clark County, Vancouver area. So there, you saw the changes. The changes have even been more so. Some of the industrial areas have been very hard hit. You just feel it. It feels like Rust Belt towns in some ways when you go there now.
So in terms of when you went to Congress, obviously you were going there for a reason. You probably had some things on your agenda in terms of policy that you wanted to change, right? And in terms of the bills that you decided to author, right? This is something I'm interested in understanding, the thought process from a member, right? What do you decide to work on and why? What problems are you looking to address, or what solutions are you latching on to? What bills are you writing? Where is that information coming from? Is it from your district? Is it from your personal experience? Is it from your party? Is it from lobbyists? Is it from associations? Where are you getting the ideas, and which ones do you how do you decide which ones to sponsor and to spend time on?
That's a great question, and it varies. But for me, the first and most important priority is what's in the interest of the local district. You just have to remember it's a republic. You're there to represent people. And so I really, really, really tried to listen to what the needs of the district were. And so, and I was open to there was not, once we got elected, I told my staff, look, you run on partisan, maybe in party lines, but you get elected and you, at that instant, you represent the entire district. So we're never going to ask people, what political party are you? Who'd you vote for? Just what are your needs? And so a number of issues just came out of that. And talking with folks in the district, and they'd say, Congressman, this is a problem for my business, or this is affecting our family, or this is affecting our community. So that was always the most important basis. And that was not just legislatively, it was in terms of casework, constituent service. I used to do a lot of town halls, more than 350 over my time in Congress. And I felt that was important. So I could hear, I just wanted an open door and an open ear to people. Secondly, I tended to try to look for areas that I thought were very important and were not being addressed. Things that other members might overlook. One area, for example, is the health of our oceans. 78% or more of the surface of this planet is water. And if you wanted to count the numbers of people who are passionate about the oceans, it's probably less than 20 in the whole Congress. That's a profound disjunction in terms of the priorities. So I wrote the Federal Ocean Acidification Research and Monitoring Act. Well, that's a mouthful as a title, but what it meant was, as you know, the other effect we all hear about, CO2 in the air leading to climate change, global warming. The other thing CO2 does, it dissolves in the water, makes the water more acidic, and that affects crustaceans and shelled organisms and coral reefs. That affects the whole ecosystem of the oceans, which is powerfully important, dramatically overlooked. So I wrote that bill. I did a lot also to make Congress function, and we can talk about that as well. One bill that I'm particularly proud of was I wrote the STOCK Act. STOCK stood for Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge. The idea was members of Congress previously were not bright line prohibited from trading on confidential knowledge they heard in the course of their job. And I thought that was crazy. And I also felt we needed to report more promptly. So prior to the STOCK Act, members of Congress reported their financial trades at the end of the year, in fact, in May of the following year. So if there was an election year, and I did a lot of questionable trades during that year or the prior year, the voters would not know about it till after the election was over. Well, we changed that thanks to the STOCK Act. And that's had a powerful impact. It may have determined the fate of the Senate. I think it had a lot to do with the balance of power in the Senate as it exists today. So I looked for niche kind of things that I thought would make a difference at the national level. I did a number of other things on congressional ethics, on time to read legislation, et cetera. And then because I chaired the science committee, I did a number of bills relating to science and education. And then, so that's kind of the package.
And I'm curious a little bit more on the town halls question, because I know you've done a lot of town halls. And I always wonder about the concept of personal interaction between the member and the district, because, I'm assuming your district was about 700,000 people as a typical.
Yeah, about 750. Yeah.
And, even if you shook some people's hand every day, all year long, you're going to be in how many are you going to meet? 1,000, 2,000 of those 700? And is that a statistically relevant and representative sample? So I always wonder about that. I've talked to some other people in the program who are trying to do some virtual town halls that, try to get a more representative group. But, what was your experience? Did you feel like those town halls were representative, or were you always kind of skeptical of who you were getting at those town halls because they were by nature going to be more engaged or more extreme?
That's a great question. It evolved over time, and it didn't evolve in a good way. And I just felt it's important to go and be available. People have a right to come talk to you, to ask you questions, to look you in the eye, person to person, and share what matters to them. And it wasn't just town halls. I visited every port in my district every 2 years. I visited every hospital, every high school, every public high school in my district. I tried to visit every 2 years. So I just felt you had to be there. That's your job. They have to know who you are. They have a right to confront you and disagree with you or whatever. Our town halls initially were always very positive events that, very informal. We'd hold it at a firehouse or at a library or a school auditorium or something. And people, for anybody was free to come. You could raise your hand. I'd call on you. We'd have a discussion. It was all civil. Over time, sadly, the tone changed, especially in the area, the rise of the Tea Party movement, the time of the Affordable Care Act. And this had been preceded during the Brady bill. The prior, wasn't there for the Brady bill, but town halls got pretty raucous and dangerous actually during that period. As things got more crazy and people began to become more bitterly divided, the tone of the town halls changed. And there were websites, believe it or not, Matt, dedicated, literal whole websites, how to disrupt a town hall. And they would say things like, here's your strategy, place people around the room, have one person get up and shout the person down, let the other person, and actually one of them explicitly said, do not let there be a rational discussion. That was their goal. We had one town hall that the numbers were so big and the crowd so raucous that we held it in an outdoor amphitheater. 3,500 people attended. That's just unimaginable, but we did it. The backstory of that too was, though, that the threat level was perceived to be high enough that at some of those town halls, we had an ambulance parked in the back with a crash cart, a life support crash cart right beside the stage. So if I got shot, they could get me to the hospital. Now, I still went ahead and did the town halls, but it became less pleasant. And that was somewhat of a precursor, I think, to the kind of things we saw on January 6th. That's really sad, because you should be able to meet one another and disagree respectfully and learn from one another. And I came away a better person for having town halls. And frankly, I think a better person for having had to represent a swing district. If you're in an absolutely secure district, left or right, then you just throw red meat to the base and you can forget about everybody else and just worry about a primary. If you're sincere and you represent a swing district, you've got to talk to the Sierra Club one day and a logging family the next. You've got to work talk to a labor union one day and a struggling business owner the next. And you really have to honor all those constituencies.
So if we move back to the bills, then you've selected which bills you're going to write based on, it sounds like a different variety of perspectives, some competitive in nature. Who else is writing bills on the same topic? Others related directly to the district, others of personal interest or expertise. Now you've got your bill. So how do you try to get it passed? Are you going around everyone trying to persuade them? Are you promising leadership that you'll do X, Y, or Z? Are you engaging in trade, with all the different members? If you vote for my bill, I'll vote for yours. What's the path to get those things passed?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it varies again. But first of all, I don't think anything happens in Congress without a champion. You've got to have somebody who's passionate about your legislation if you're trying to promote something, or about the bill they're trying to push. Lots of members of Congress will sign on to bills, and that's important. People will say, would you co-sponsor this bill? That's important, but unless somebody's pushing the bill, really saying, I want this to get passed, it's probably not going anywhere. And even if someone is pushing, it's a challenging thing to get legislation passed. It's especially challenging if you're in the minority. It's especially challenging if it's a bill that somehow disrupts the status quo, or has, to be honest, has powerful financial interests lined up against it. And financial, either in terms of the scale of the economic enterprise or the political fundraising and contributions. I never was much for a trading approach. If you do this, I'll do that. It's just, I can't think of a single time in Congress where I held out and said, I want a bridge for my district, or I want this. If the issue was important, it deserved my sincere attention to the issue as the issue. I did, however, work very, very hard when I had a piece of legislation. I'll give you one example. My state was one of 7 states that had, we have a sales tax and no income tax. In 1986, the ability to deduct your income tax was retained in the tax code, but sales tax was taken out. Well, what that did was it basically left the 7 sales tax dependent states disadvantaged because our people couldn't deduct what they paid in sales tax. Well, that was an injustice. And I worked on a bipartisan, built a good coalition. It's kind of a fun story. I went to the second baseman and the shortstop from the Republican Party for help. And why did I do that? Because Kevin Brady from Texas and Zach Wamp from Tennessee were good ball players, became friends, and they also had state sales tax. So I said, look, you guys have something in common with us. We're getting ripped off in the tax code. Let's fix this. So I literally went around the floor of the House talking to every single member from the affected states, built a coalition. That coalition became strong enough that we could tell leadership on both sides, if you don't include this in the bill, you don't get the vote. It wasn't a trade for build a bridge or anything like that. It was say, be fair to our states or don't expect us to pass the bill. Well, we passed that, and it saved billions of dollars for my taxpayers every year until the most recent tax bill that eliminated or set a different standard for all deduction. So that was where you take a bill, you work it hard, and it passes. And the other example real quickly, Matt, is the Stock Act got no traction, even though I worked it really, really, really hard. I talked to people and they were saying, I don't want to have to report my stock trades, or I don't think we need to do this. I worked it real hard without success. And then one day, 60 Minutes did an expose about the issue. I was honored to be featured in that a little bit. Suddenly, everybody wanted to be on the bill, and it passed into law. And it's been somewhat transformative. So it can go to both ways. Suddenly, you have to build a base.
Sounds like one of them was inside ball and the other was outside ball.
Well, that's really exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah.
Great. Well, let's move on to the subject end of the bills. And I know you've pushed this notion of there need to be sufficient time for members to read bills before they vote on them, right? When we're presumed that would have been a long-standing requirement. But can you talk to us a little bit about that? You know, what were you pushing? What's the problem there?
Well, I took the job really seriously. I wanted to know what we were doing and why. And we were literally being given 1,000-page bills with less than 24 hours to read them. And they would sometimes, the spending would be hundreds of billions of dollars. So you've got, at one point I brought the whole bill to the floor and I said, it's an OSHA violation for me to try to lift it, let alone try to read it. And I basically I did two things. I created legislation, introduced it that said that we cannot read a legislation until not only a bill has been available for us to read, but for the public to read. And the idea was kind of we didn't call it then crowdsourcing, but the idea was if the public can read the legislation, they can make an informed comment, and with the collective set of eyes, they could say, hey, watch it, we're concerned about this, or we like this. And now, not everybody's going to get what they want, but they have a right to see what there is. And I was not necessarily popular with my leadership because, as you know, when there's a key bill, the WHIPS organization, which I was part of, comes around and says, how do you plan to vote? And I would say, I will vote no until 72 hours. And on major pieces of legislation, they knew that for me personally, they couldn't get my vote unless there was 72 hours to read it. And on a few occasions, the vote would be 432 to 1. I was the one. And at one point, we actually had a bill that included a provision about the tax code that was not a good provision. And I was the only person who voted against the bill. They later had to bring it up again to modify the bill because there was really an egregious problem with the original draft. And there were more than one occasion where I just said, look, you're just not going to get my vote until we do it. Sadly, both parties at different times in their own rules, both the Democrats and the Republicans have had a 72-hour provision in the rules, but then they waive that provision when, as they would say, is necessary, as I would say, when convenient. And sometimes both parties have said, well, this bill, a variation of this bill is so important, we have to pass it before people have time to read it. And I thought that was nuts. I never bought it.
So let's go then to the deeper question of what do you think the members should do when they get a bill, right? A vote's coming up. What should they be doing? Should they be reading it, coming up with their own thoughts about whether it's a good or bad idea? Should they be talking to experts? Should they do what the party tells them to do? Should they do what their leader tells them? What do you think the responsibility is of the member?
The responsibility of the member is to do everything the member possibly can to make sure they have the best informed vote they can, and the most responsible vote consistent with the Constitution, with the needs of their constituents, and with their own personal value set and what they stand for. That's a complex process. You don't have time to read every piece of legislation yourself, but you need to hire great staff. You need to reach out to others who know what they're doing. That could be independent experts. I often consulted independent experts, especially people whose lives would be impacted by it. We had legislation, for example, about the Columbia River, which I represented. So I got on the phone and called the barge operators and called the people who run the dams and called fishermen and said, how will this affect you? I mean, literally personally called them and said, we've got this bill. I need to know your concerns. You've got your own staff, you've got the committee staff, you've got the caucus information, et cetera. Then you should listen to all that information, and then you should reach out to other members. So many, many times I have a group of people who I respected, admired, trusted, and I would call them and say, tell me how you're planning to vote on this and why. And you learn pretty quickly the people who are going to give you sort of banal or facile or cheap answers, and the people who will give you thoughtful answers. And on many occasions, my vote changed because of that. It wasn't a quid pro quo thing. It was somebody brought up a point that I hadn't seen, or they saw it differently than me. And I think sometimes that happened where people would come to me and say, especially even in mid-time, Matt, you're looking on the screen up there and you say, Baird is on aye, 3 or 4 people I respect are on no. We're looking around the room, we sit down. Why are you on no? Well, I see it this way. And that's really an important process. So it's not perfect, but we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And if we're elected as a republic to represent, that's a sacred and solemn obligation. I have to do my level best to know what the heck I'm voting on so I can defend it. And I have to be willing, I always said this, you have to be willing to lose the job in order to deserve the job, which means sometimes you have to take a vote that your polling says is going to hurt you, that the House leadership says, or your own party leadership says is not what they want, maybe even that your constituents don't want, but it's because you've done your job, you've studied the issue, you're doing what you think is right, and you have to let the chips fall where they may.
You're jumping ahead to my representation question, which we'll get to a little bit later. But in terms of the actual bill before you, in that case, it sounds like you think there needs to be sufficient time, maybe not to read the bill, but to get a sufficient understanding of the bill. You think that's a 72-hour window?
Minimum.
At a minimum, okay. And then it sounds like one of the key elements in your consideration is your fellow colleagues' potential for persuasion, right? In that case, you cited that you were persuaded by others that the bill was in your best interest, or was in the best interest of your district. Right. Now, that goes directly against what most scholars are saying, which that persuasion is impossible in Congress. But it's heartening to hear you say that you were actually convinced by arguments within a kind of a dialogue or debate inside Congress.
Yeah. Let me stay on that 72-hour point for a sec too, Matt. In the traditional model, the how a bill becomes law, the Schoolhouse Rock model, it's not just 72 hours. In the traditional model, you've seen the train coming for months, right? It went through subcommittee, then through committee, maybe multiple subcommittees and committees. Then it came up, that was filed in advance. You could see what amendments were coming up. You could contemplate the amendments. You then had debate on the floor, sometimes, occasionally, actual amendments introduced in real time on the floor. And then you had this other body, the Senate, doing the same. And then you had conference, and then it came back for final passage. That's the traditional model. Almost nothing happens in the traditional model anymore. It's more likely, increasingly, that something comes down ex cathedra almost from the leadership, one way or another. They work with the party, the committee chairs, and maybe some caucus leadership. They huddle in a room. The rest, everybody's spectator sports. They may have some comment in their caucus or the Republican conference, but the bill comes down not having gone through subcommittee, not having gone through committee, not having gone through regular order, little time to read, and you're just told vote on it. And I repeatedly said nuts to And so 72 hours is the minimum, but it assumes you've had all the other things. It's even less time under the more modern process, which is really lamentable because I don't think we get as good of, we don't get as good a representation that way.
Yeah. So you're bringing up the concept now of leadership, and why don't we move on to that subject?
Sure.
So the Speaker of the House, as today is known to have, a huge amount of power compared to the historical circumstances. And, I've had others on the program in the past. I think Mickey Edwards, the most outspoken, that the Speaker of the House should be an elected position. Now you have your own position on this, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on the chair of the Speaker of the House and how how that position should happen and what powers it should have.
Yeah, I'm not averse to it being elected. I have immense respect for Mickey Edwards, a really thoughtful and wise person. My take is this: the institution needs an independent arbiter, somebody who makes sure that the fair play happens. And we don't, in almost any other venue which might be considered competitive, we don't allow one team to pick the arbiters. We don't say you get to pick the referees for the football game or the hockey match or the basketball game. There's an independent person presiding over it, whose mission is not to determine beforehand or write the rules so that they know one side will win. Their mission is to make sure the game is played well and fairly. And there are two models that I'll cite for this. And I've spent a lot of time studying the Constitutional Convention. And as you know, Washington presided over that. But interestingly, Washington was the presiding officer, but did almost little to influence the conflict, or the content rather. He was there to make sure that the deliberative process worked, that all sides had opportunities to speak, and they indeed did, and to make sure the process had dignity and fairness and proceeded well. The record shows that I think he introduced one amendment, if I'm not mistaken. It was almost unanimously adopted immediately, but the rest of the time, he was virtually silent during that. Now, behind the scenes, he did things for sure, but it was not, I want to make sure the South wins or the North wins. There were no obvious stated political parties at the time. And he, as you know, in his farewell address, cautioned against that. So Washington is a pretty good model. And imagine how the House would work if, instead of saying, let's pick the majority leader of one party or the other party and have them preside in their party's interest, we had somebody who said, well, let's make sure the other side gets some amendments here too. And there's a little of that happens, but not enough. Let's make sure there's ample time to consider legislation. Let's make sure the schedule proceeds in a respectable way. Let's make sure there's dignity in how people address one another, et cetera. So some of that happens, but it could happen more, I believe, with an independent person. And if you look over the last number of years, you could imagine a Colin Powell, a Lee Hamilton. There are a number of statesmen and stateswomen who could have done that job and allowed the parties to do their thing, and the body could function better. The other example, by the way, is the British House of Commons, which their parliamentarian, though chosen from a party, immediately eschews the partisan alignment once they become the role of speaker. And now, historically, some have leaned one way or another, but in theory, at least, they establish independence and neutrality, except for the proceeding process itself, and make sure that's good. That's their loyalty there.
And so your idea here on the independent speaker, is it a member still, or is it a non-member that you have in mind?
Great question. Doesn't have to be a member. The Constitution just says the House shall choose its own speaker. It's CHUSE in actual language. And that means, quite theoretically, you could imagine a case where a narrowly divided House, like we have now, where say centrists on one side or another could partner with the other party and say, look, we'll partner with you to choose an independent speaker. You could imagine that process, because that way, you could say neither side wins, neither side loses as much. It could be an independent person. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. I doubt it will ever happen, because the speaker wields incredible control. They determine who will get committee assignments, and who will chair committees, what bills will or will not come before the Congress. So the punitive impact of what would amount to they might see as a coup, although it's perfectly within the rules and it may be in the best interest of the institution, but the possibility that people could be punished for the audacity to say, what if we had just an independent speaker who made the place work, is pretty high. But conceptually, the idea of focusing on how the institution can function and serve the people, not the party, is worthwhile.
Well, that brings up the notion of the party rules, which I've always been kind of confused that members within the Congress are subject to any external rules, whether they're from party or any other kind of rule. I would think that's a kind of some kind of external control over a member's action. Can you talk about the role of party rules? I mean, party can really, at the end of the day, the party has the carrot and the stick of committee assignment, money maybe for campaigns and things like that. And that's really what enforces whatever rules they want to impose on their members. Can you talk through your perspective on that?
Well, unlike a lot of parliamentary systems, there's no loyalty oath or there's no, you run as an affiliation with a party, or you can run as an independent, but you're perfectly free at any point to vote your conscience in the Congress. And that's a good thing. That doesn't mean it's without consequence. You can be, and as we've seen in the case most recently of Liz Cheney, for example, who I think took a position of integrity, her party is punishing her for that. And she, to her credit, has made the decision that her country comes first. There's a distinction between that kind of personal integrity position and maybe somebody's involved with scandal or has done something unethical, and then the party's punished for that grounds. The institution can punish for that ground above and beyond party. So one of the interesting challenges is, where does, as an individual representative, where does your allegiance lie? You take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. The Constitution never has had the word political party in it, never appears anywhere. And that's your primary commitment. And it should be also to the people of your district. Now, as I mentioned earlier, to deserve the position, you may have to lose the position. And sometimes your party will be really mad at you. You'll have taken a position that was not along the party lines. I did it on several occasions, and people got upset, and they have a right to. But my responsibility personally at the end of the day is to be able to look myself in the mirror and the people I most care about and say, did I act with integrity, and was I honest? And if I can pass that standard, I can get another job.
I mean, if those party rules were stripped or made illegal, like, or the process was changed such that speakers didn't decide who was on which committees, how do you think the Congress would change?
That's a really interesting question. And we actually, when the Democrats were, a number of us, when the Democrats were poised to retake majority back in 06, I believe it was, proposed some rules changes within the Democratic caucus. So there's rules that govern the body itself, and then both the Democratic caucus and the Republican conference have their own internal rules. And it's the internal rules of the party as it functions. It's not like the national party you see on TV at the conventions. It's more the caucus rules or the conference rules in the House. Those rules govern how, let's say, how committee chairs will be chosen. Well, in the Democratic side, at least, the speaker has a lot of say over the subgroup that decides committee chairmanships. And that then leads to sort of, not exactly, I would never say exactly loyalty oaths, but certainly loyalty tests, where it can be, well, the speaker doesn't support this person. Maybe they disagreed with the speaker's election. They voted for the other candidate. Maybe they disagreed on an important piece of legislation. But it is seen by the speaker that the rules must be such that they allow the speaker to have great leverage over the party. And there's merit to that in some ways. It's how parties get things done. In longer ago history, post Watergate revolution, there was sort of an uprising of the young folks on the Democratic side. Then later, the Republicans did it, that changed those rules and gave more power to the members of the caucus. I think there are a number of ways we could empower the members themselves. I'll give you one small example, but a very powerful example. right now, a small group of members, a small portion of the overall body are appropriators. The chair, they get to decide where the money goes. Everybody else is spectators when it's time to dole out the money, or supplicants. You have to sort of plead with the chair of the Appropriations Committee to get this money or that money for this or that. I don't think it's a good institution where everybody's elected equally to represent their district, but some of the members then become supplicants and others become what they call cardinals. The 13 chairs of the Appropriations Committee are cardinals, like in the Catholic Church. Wouldn't it be interesting if every member of Congress were an appropriator within a small circumscribed area of specialization, and that we then divided the appropriations schedule into 2-year tranches, so you appropriated over a 2-year span, so that agencies could plan ahead and you could actually build expertise. I mean, imagine 13 people managing all the spending of all the federal government. Now, that's not, the actual committee size exceeds 13, obviously, but that's 13 chairs. That's a lot to cover. And that's the same is true on the tax side in the Ways and Means Committee. Imagine if we shifted that, gave more members more responsibility for more appropriations, spread the value, spread the responsibility, spread the authority. I think it'd have a good effect.
That's a very interesting proposal. Would love to dig into that further at a later time. So back to the speaker's power, right? Obviously, the key reason, one of the key reasons the speaker has all this power is because they control the Rules Committee and they control the floor.
Right.
What is your thought on what that appropriate role should be? And are you a fan of regular order? It should go back to regular order. Are there ways you would change the way the floor works?
Well, I would certainly change, as I mentioned earlier. I'd start way upstream. I'd start with the bills don't come to the floor until they've gone through committee and sub, except in some kind of crisis situation, which we've had, and that'll occur. But the general regular order is subcommittee, committee, et cetera. Amendments posted in advance, time for actual debate, more open rules. You can chart, and I've done this and looked at the charts. An open rule is a rule in which people are allowed to produce amendments in real time, that you could hear part of the bill and you can actually stand up and say, I'd like to amend. The kind of thing you think happens. You hear part of a bill, somebody rises and say, I appreciate what the gentlelady's just said. I wonder if she'd accept a friendly amendment. Golly gee, that used to happen in the Congress. It almost never happens now. Some trace it to C-SPAN, some trace it to television. Now it's a series of prepared remarks that nobody watches, except, total junkies like me and maybe you and others. But what happens is, instead of actually listening and saying, now, what did you just say you would like to see in this bill? That's interesting. This does happen sometimes in committees and subcommittees, where someone from one party will raise a legitimate concern. The other party will respect that concern and say, we thank the gentleman or the gentlelady, we can support this. Or I hear your concern, here's my concern. Can we have a colloquy? Can we adjourn for 5 minutes and get together and see to work this out? That actually happens when subcommittees and committees are allowed to actually do their work. It almost never happens on the floor, and it should, but it doesn't. So the rules that would allow that, and people will say, well, it's inefficient. It doesn't have to be inefficient. Split the appropriations up, have more on-schedule working days rather than flying home days. You can make it work. Plan things a little better. We could make it work in a much better way.
Well, you bring up the time element, which is my next question. How would you allocate Congress's time? Are you a 2 weeks on, 1 week off guy, 3 weeks on, 1 week off? You obviously left Congress because you wanted to spend more time with family. So maybe you'll have some further insights into this.
Yeah, well, it varies, but I would be much more of a 3 week on, 1 week off kind of person, and make it predictable. Because what happens is, if I've got a full week and I know when that week is going to come, I can really pack my district. I can really say, okay, so I'm going to be having 15 town halls. I'm going to meet with the hospitals. This bill is coming up, going to meet with whoever is affected by it. Then I can really, really focus. The other thing that could happen with that, and sadly, when people run against the institution, they get what they sow. If we had 3 weeks on, it would make sense to move your family to DC. Now, not everybody wants to do that, but from the collegiality perspective, if you're 3 weeks on, full weeks, I mean, start the business day early Monday morning, finish it late Friday, you got the weekend, you would get together more often with colleagues. I was asked near the end of the time I was in Congress, how often do you get together socially? Not, not at a fundraiser, not at a political event, not on a congressional delegation trip with other members of Congress and their family. The answer was less than 10 times in 12 years. Well, it's a lot harder to hate somebody if you know their kids. It depends on their kids, I guess, but if we actually spent time together, as they once did in Congress, got to know one another across the aisle, went to dinner, played golf, played cards, whatever, we would get along better. And so I'm very much more of make the schedule where we're doing that. Then the other thing is we've got to somehow change campaign finance, because when you're spending 30, 40, sometimes 50% of your time begging for money, it gives you less time to study the issues, less time to work with colleagues, and it ultimately compromises your integrity. And not that you get bought explicitly, but you are cognizant that if you take certain votes, certain campaign contributions will dry up. And that has more impact than it should. Not that people are corrupt, but the system puts them in an untenable position.
So, one of the problems that seems to be increasing is this incivility in Congress. And, instead of debating the issues, there's personal attacks, between members. This isn't new, obviously. I went back to the beginning, but seems to be increasing. What, as a psychologist, right, a neuropsychologist, did you come up with any tricks, any rules that would reduce that? Is it hopeless? Should they just be automatically expelled if they attack another member? What are your thoughts on that and how it can be improved?
It's not only a great question, and maybe the great question right now, Matt. How can we get the institution to function? I'll give you a couple thoughts on it. I'm a huge fan of how Rotary clubs begin their meetings. And Rotary, as you know, they have the premise of service over self. That's their motto. But on top of that, every Rotary club begins, and I've been to a lot of Rotary clubs meetings, they begin with the four-way test. And I'll paraphrase it here, but is it the truth? Is it fair? Will it build goodwill among all the participants? And is it in the best interest of all concerned? Now, not that every bill is going to make everybody happy, but if we thought before we started, is what I'm saying true? Is it fair to the other side, or is it for political advantage? Will what I'm saying and will how I'm saying it help build goodwill? And will this try to benefit the greater good? That would change things. The other thing is we need respectful humility and curiosity, meaning I don't want to go in and assume that I know everything. And nor do I want to assume that the other person is necessarily bad or wrong. Now, sometimes they are. Sometimes there are bad people who get in Congress, and there are sometimes people who are just flat wrong, and they believe crazy stuff, right? But many people, we just have different perspectives. They have a different constituency, and they do. Maybe they represent an inner city community, and I represent the rural communities. Maybe they represent, maybe they have a strong business background, and I have a strong affinity for labor. Okay, but let's listen. So we've got to try to restore that. And then we have to, back to the service thing I started with. When we're asking candidates, when we're selecting candidates as voters, so much now it's where they stand on issues or who said what. I'm more interested in what kind of person are we sending to office? Are they a person of integrity? Have they demonstrated a commitment to service in their community? Are they willing to work with people they disagree with? Will they set aside personal self-interest for the interests of the greater good? And have they shown a willingness to do that? One of our problems, Matt, is the qualities it takes to win an election are not necessarily the qualities it takes to govern wisely and well. And we've got to somehow find ways to select candidates and support candidates who have integrity and character and a willingness to work for solutions over charisma and demagoguery and sloganeering and money.
So it sounds like you think one of the solutions is culture, obviously, the improvement in culture. One is on, the who we're sending in the first place, right? The kind of people that show up. what about in terms of the rules, the civility kinds of rules in Congress? In theory, the House can remove people, right, that it doesn't like, that's in the Constitution.
Yeah.
And, there's 435 people, 1% a year of bad apples per year to kick out. Doesn't seem to be like a lot to me,
Yeah.
based on violating, certain civility norms.
Yeah.
Is that a hopeless kind of way to do it? Is that not the right way as a psychologist? What do you think?
Well, there is the House, there's the internal ethics committee, and then there's the external committee, which was established a while back, and they've done some good work. I personally would like to see both parties. I'd like to see there be a civility pledge where both parties, all parties, renounce any acts or threats of violence against any elected or employed public official at any level of government. And that we call on the elders, the presidents from both parties, former presidents and vice presidents, the leaders of both parties, current and former, and the current members in the House, Senate, and every legislature and governor to sign on. And if somebody won't sign that, the public has to ask them why. Are you seriously telling me that you won't sign on to a bill that say acts or threats of violence are not tolerated? Your party, whatever party you're in, will not condone that. I mean, we have, bless their hearts, we have school board members getting death threats. And we have public health officials who want to vaccinate children to save their lives, getting death threats to such a level that they're leaving their professions. That cannot sustain a democracy. And any party or any person who would not sign such a simple civility pledge, will you insist that no person, no threats or acts of violence against any employee or elected official will be tolerated for any reason, period? I would start with that. And then I would uphold the standards of decency and integrity in the House and the Senate.
But no hard rules in the chambers themselves.
Well, there are hard rules already. I mean, personal ad hominem attacks are prevented. That's why you hear people say the gentlelady from, the gentleman from, the other body. We refer to the Senate as the other body, and there are provisions, and the penalty is that the words can be taken down, which means this person has crossed the line. But that is in the floor. That happens in the context of the floor debate, the debate everyone can watch. We have people walking around right now wearing, members of Congress making cartoons about killing their fellow members of Congress. We have members of Congress wearing t-shirts that everybody knows are euphemisms for F the president. Members of Congress, right? If the public wants to do it, First Amendment, they're welcome to do it. Members of Congress should not be doing that. And the fact that they think it's funny or cute or excusable is profoundly troubling. And the body needs to stand up for it. The fact that in the last month before you and I are talking about it, one member of Congress gleefully circulated a cartoon which depicted him killing a colleague. And his peers from his own party refused to sanction that is not only shameful, it's dangerous. And there's no way, if my best friend did that in Congress, I would have sanctioned him. And there's no way I would have condoned it. I would absolutely sanction my very best friend. I'd sanction my speaker. You cannot have that. You just can't have it. And yet, more than 100 members of the other party condoned it. They refused to censure a person who thought it was funny to joke about killing somebody in a time when my dear friend Gabby Giffords was nearly assassinated. My friend from the other side of the aisle, Steve Scalise, and his colleagues in the Republican Party were nearly assassinated. This is not funny, and it's not consistent with a stable democracy, and we've got to change it.
Well, I think the other issue with it is that they're putting this concept of party or a special group's interest above the interests of the body or the nation.
Right.
Right. And, that's a question, I guess, that's a more fundamental one when it relates to party in particular. A lot of, political scientists that I've talked to, and I think even 20, 30 years ago, there was this sense that things were too chaotic. There weren't, organized platforms, the parties didn't represent some kind of cohesive, interwoven set of principles. And so a lot of scholars and others thought that the way to go was stronger parties that made more sense,
Yeah.
that had more and ideologically consistent positions, and could wield power in a unified way. Now, they've sort of got what they wanted to a certain extent, right? They've got these parties, but that entity, that party, has now grown. The allegiance has gone to this party instead of to the nation. And so when you talk about service, you bring up the notion of service. The service to what? If people think their service is to the party, they can make any kind of XYZ decision. If they think their service is to the country or to the Congress, they'll make a different set of choices. So your notion of service has to surpass party interest in order for it to be effective.
Absolutely. And it's a combination. You're absolutely right, Matt, in the way you analyze that. It's a combination of factors that have gotten us here. The selectivity of news media, broadcast media first, where you can watch MSNBC or you can watch Fox and you get a different reality. That then amplified exponentially by algorithm-driven social media, which drives you not only to a different reality, but fictitious reality now potentially. That then amplified by natural selection of people moving to where they're politically comfortable. So if you want to be conservative, you're not necessarily likely to move to Seattle, and vice versa. If you want to be progressive, Texas, parts of Texas, at least many parts, may not be so hospitable to you. So people naturally select, amplify that by gerrymandering, and then amplify that by negative messaging on all forms of media. And you got a recipe for division. I mean, you almost couldn't design it better. And that's why in many polls, you see it's not just that the ideas are different. People hate each other and they fear each other. And so the polls get curved apart so that the bulk of Republicans are way over here, not just I believe what Republicans say, but I hate what Democrats say. Over here, the Democrats are not just I believe what the Democrats say, but I hate the Republicans. And the numbers, the last tally I heard was there were only 16 members of the House who represented districts that went the other way for president in terms of partisan identification. Well, that means everybody's being decided not based on personal character, integrity, and qualifications, but what jersey do you wear? And as soon as you make it through the primary, your sole job is to make sure everybody knows you wear a red jersey or everybody knows you wear a blue jersey. And then sadly, you've then got parties penalizing, as we see with throwing Liz Cheney out of position and Adam Kinzinger, et cetera. All those things are then leading to the divisions, and we've lost track of what's good for the country. And sadly, as you know well, that has been fomented by our adversaries. One of the great ironies and tragedies is that some of the division has been fomented. 40 million Americans retweeted or redistributed on social media fake information planted by Russian troll farms. So our nation's adversary planted false information into our system, and 40 million Americans recirculated it. We got a problem. But that Matt, is what helps drive us apart. And I fear for the country that way. One of my best friends is Bob Inglis, Republican from South Carolina. Bob's notable because he's a Republican who believed in climate change and believed the evidence in climate change. He was on a science committee. We were on together. We've become dear friends. He got beat because he believed in climate change, because he looked at the scientific evidence, believed that the fate of the world was at stake, and got attacked. But Bob says to me, Brian, if McDonald's spent all day saying, those Burger King burgers are just terrible, they'll kill you. That hamburger that Burger King makes is terrible. It'll kill you. And Burger King ran a lot of ads saying, those McDonald's hamburgers, they're just dangerous. They're going to kill you. He said, they think that they're going to drive people their way, but what they're going to really do is make people hate hamburgers. And our politics right now is everybody telling everybody how bad the other side is. And that's terribly destructive. The people they believe we're all venal, selfish, irresponsible, and we're not. And we've got to help change that.
Well, we're going to my question finally on representation then, right? Because no district is 100% one way or the other.
Right.
There's also the notion of time. So maybe I can ask just the question fundamentally. You already sort of answered it, but what is your conception of representation? What did it mean to you when you were representing your district?
Well, I think it meant I had an obligation to listen, to do my best to do what I thought was right for the country, to do what was right for my district, to uphold the Constitution, obviously, and to try to look ahead and see what problems might be lying ahead that we weren't dealing with, and to try to keep everybody with equal respect. That meant from the poorest member of my district to the richest, from a Republican to a Democrat to an independent, try to say, my job is to be your representative. One other set of reforms we haven't talked about, Matt, is it is entirely possible to look at alternative election systems and even alternative ways of representing districts that might be salutary, that might help us. My good friend Chris Novoselic, who used to head Fair Vote, also, by the way, used to be the bass player for Nirvana. Chris is a scholar of representation, and I've learned a ton from Chris. Chris has pointed out that for many years, people had multi-member represented districts, which meant that the same district could send two people. They still had the proportionate representation of the state still has to be the same. But in my state, for example, there's the Cascade Mountains with the east tend to be red, the west tends to be blue, with some variations on that. But what if you had a district with both a Democrat and Republican representing the same district? Now they'd have common interests. Instead of saying, I'm going to represent the party, they'd say, we're both representing people from both parties who have shared interests. How can we work together as a team, not only on this, but on other ways? Not only did I work with Bob Inglis, but I worked with my dear friend Greg Walden, who was a Republican in Republican leadership. His district was across the river of mine. We liked each other. We respected and trusted each other, did a lot of legislating together. So there are ways to do this, to bring folks together. And I really think we'll have better representation if people say, I'm here to represent my constituents and the country and work together for the greater good, not just to win applause from one side or the other.
So it sounds like your view is you represent everybody in the district. And from what you mentioned earlier, you're not just a window into their current beliefs, but you're also making judgments about what you think is in their best interests. Is that right? So you're more of a Burkean, is that right?
Yeah, I think you have to ultimately make the decision based on the evidence. You have to be vigorous in trying to understand the evidence, respectful of the different positions, even if you disagree with them. And at the end of the day, say, what is the position of the choices I'm given? And sometimes you're not given good choices. In the middle of the Iraq War, having voted against the invasion, still believing it was the biggest mistake in the history of our country in foreign policy and militarily. But we were beginning to make some progress, and I felt it would be irresponsible to withdraw prematurely. That was not a popular position on the left, but I'd been to the country 5 times. I talked at length to leaders throughout, and military leaders, foreign policy leaders, and I believed it was the right thing to do. Many in my party got so mad at me. They said, you're no different than George Bush. You're a fascist, blah, blah, blah. We had some pretty unpleasant town halls. But look, at the end of the day, if the integrity and national security of our country is at stake, and the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians and of our soldiers, and the mission of our soldiers at stake, I got to do what I think is right. The same is true when it comes to climate. Bob said, I know a lot of my friends in Republican circles know that climate change is real. They're just afraid they'd lose elections. Well, wait a second. If you'd sacrifice the national security of your country in order to placate a group or to win an election, or you'd sacrifice the fate of planet Earth to keep your job, what does that say about you? Sometimes you've got to be able to go forward and say, look, I know this is how you see it, but here's the information I have, and I see it differently. And I respect the right to differ, but I'm going to take this position. If you want to unelect me, you can, but don't just do it because you think I didn't play the team line well. Do it because you think you've equally looked at the information and we've reached a disagreement, and you can unelect me. But I'm not going to tell you something I think is false just to make you happy so that I'll get your vote. Because if so, then I don't deserve your vote.
How about future generations? When you thought about your representation, did you think about, the kids, schools, next, 1 or 2 generations down, 5 generations down? How did you conceive of future constituents?
That's the fundamental question right now, Matt. It should always be paramount. Our job is to look at how this is going to affect the future. And that in an election cycle where it's all about raising money and who can get the best attack ads, and we look for, everybody's like, in an election, it's always a damn election year. You just have to say, look, I'm not going to take stupid, bad votes for the sake of winning an election. I've got a responsibility to my kids, to their grandkids, and not only those kids, everybody's kids and grandkids. And if that means that I have to say things that are tough or make decisions that are tough, I have to do it. And you're right that we have lost track of that. We've just lost track of that sense of obligation to the future, which was so fundamental. We pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That's how we ended the Declaration. Our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And they trusted in posterity because they put it all on the line. Some of them got killed because of that. And that legacy image, and the founders were just filled with that. The framers, when they were talking as they formed the Constitution, as they debated the Declaration, it was so much about the future. How can we create a country that will, that will honor? We hold these truths to be self-evident, and we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, promote the general welfare, etc. These were big, help the world, help the constituents ideas. If we forget that, they didn't say we, the people, in order to prevail as a party.
Right. Great. Well, next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within a 50-year time frame?
Well, one of the things that I've worked on is we're going to have to deal with technology in a responsible way, both because COVID has required that we learn how to deal with technology, that we can have meetings like you and I are having remotely. If feasible and safe, in person is always better. But if not feasible and safe, this is better than nothing for sure. So we need to make sure we deal with technology well. We seriously in the United States need to realize, and not just the United States, the tension right now between the autocratic authoritarian rule and democratic, progressive, socially progressive, democratically progressive. I don't mean like left versus right, but I mean freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of opportunity, those kind of things. The tension is, I don't think, ever been thicker than before World War II right now, or maybe even during World War II. You've got Russia, China, autocrats rising around the world, divisions in terms of authoritarianism, and we really need to rethink how our economic and our political strategies confront that. This idea that we're just going to have, that the free market will cause the Chinese, for example, or the Russians to suddenly embrace liberal, tolerant democracy was wrong. It was a hell of a mistake, and it's empowered some dangerous regimes, and we're going to have to address that. And we have to acknowledge it's going to be a tough battle. We don't want it to be a hot battle because, man, it's not good. So we're going to have to address particularly China, Russia, but not only in that hemisphere, we're going to have to address rise of autocracies around the world. And we're going to have to show that democratic institutions can work. When we tear ourselves apart internally, when we have mobs attack our own capital and deny elections, it not only threatens our country, it threatens the fate of democratic societies around the world. And if we don't appreciate that, we're playing into the hands of the enemies. And the enemies are really dangerous people for those of us who believe in freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of organization, et cetera. So we've got to address that. And we've also, as you pointed out earlier, we've got to have a bigger future in influence. We've got to do a better job of saying, how will something that seems benign or even necessarily a blessing today, what are the implications going down the road? You can't anticipate them all, but you can certainly have a future mindset. And we've also got to get past the divisions in the society. The concentration of the disparities of wealth now are unimaginable. And I'm not one of these hate corporations, hate the rich. I think that's a waste of energy. But at the same time, when tiny percentages of the population own vast percentage of the wealth and large percentages of the population are struggling to get by, something that is a recipe for social turmoil, and it's harmful to people. And it doesn't have to be. We can find ways to do that, to deal with that.
So last question is really about your plans. What are you working on currently? What do you have coming in the next 2 years?
Well, I'm working right now, Matt, on what I think is the brightest thing I can think of, which is this Museum of Service, how we celebrate the service to the greater good. That inspires me every day. It lifts me up every day. And then paradoxically, I'm also working on one of the darkest things, which we talked about a little bit earlier, which is the continuity of our government itself. What happens if there are large-scale losses due to assassination, pandemics, accidents, et cetera? How does our constitutional government with checks and balances and a representative legislature, how does that continue? Right now, we're way more fragile than most people realize. And I'm trying to help reduce that fragility by creating some institutional structures that allow for continuity of representation, that reduce incentives for assassination, that assure that even in the most dramatic and destructive attack, a representative, viable Congress could function, and that our continuity of the executive branch is also sound, which it's not now, and that we have meaningful continuity in the court system, which we don't right now. So on the one hand, I keep going with this uplifting vision of celebrating service in all its forms, and we're making progress. On the other hand, we've just got to harden the institutions of our democracy so that they'll function better, because we all depend on it. And frankly, the whole free world does. So we got to get it right.
Well, Congressman Baird, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your service to the country and continued work. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck.
Well, thank you, Matt. And I want to applaud what you do and what Sunwater is doing. I've watched your series of interviews, very thoughtful, thought-provoking. I kind of wish colleges and high schools would just have a class where because what you do is you bring out real people really in the arena who really care about the country, and you humanize it and ask great questions. I wish people would watch this, incorporate it into their schools, and say, what do we learn from this? It would change how people understand the system. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you.